Great. Yes, hello everyone again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, especially good evening to Professor Jha. I'm Cheng-Li, today's moderator of the workshop. Please, when the session is going on, please keep your microphone off unless you take the floor for questions. And the session will start with two main questions, which come out of the comments under the video lectures given by Professor Jha. And Professor, each question we would have 20 minutes to discuss. You could give a brief remark, and then we open the floor for questions. For our participants, you can type your questions in the chat box, or since we have small amount of people, so you could just take the floor for questions. So let's now welcome Professor Praveen Jha, who give us a lecture on wages in countries with labor surplus. Professor, it's the professor of economics at the JNU University in New Delhi, India. Yeah, and so please allow me to ask our first question, Professor. One of the most feasible and effective policies that could absorb the surplus labor, which has been well perceived by many participants in the lecture, lies in job creation by public sectors of the economy, namely the investment in public services and utilities. So could you please give us a brief review of the scheme, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in India, and what can other countries learn from this? Yes, Professor, this is a floor for you.
Thank you very much, and lovely to be part of this conversation again. Let me straight away come to Cheng's question. You know, if you look at countries around the world, one can make a very provocative statement in a positive sense that India is the only country in the world which has the right to employment. It sounds really grand, really big, yes. Now, what is this right to employment? Essentially, for large segments of populations and potential workers living in rural areas, and rural is defined legally. There are many aspects and dimensions of it, but in general, it is the conventional meaning of the rural, countryside and so on that we are talking about. Each household, right, in rural area is guaranteed 100 days of employment as per the law. Yeah, for all adult members, 15 plus in terms of age, yeah, and even those who are beyond the working age group, if they want, they can apply for it. Yeah, they can get this job. Yeah, so this 100 days of guaranteed employment, which came into being during the United Progressive Government led by the Congress Party about 17 years ago. And that is when it came into being. Yes, it had built on lots of employment programs and poverty alleviation programs in the preceding decades. Right? In fact, a version of, pretty diluted kind of version of what we saw in 2005 was already there in one of the provinces in India, in Maharashtra. Right? That was Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Program. Right? This was launched in the backdrop of a very serious agrarian crisis, almost a famine situation in early 1970s. So in that backdrop, this program was launched, and subsequently in 1970s and 80s, a number of employment and poverty alleviation programs were launched. Building on those, and there was a massive political mobilization for this particular program, which was launched in 2005. Quite a novel kind of program came into being. Yes, and as I said, the core of it is at some minimum wage, which need not be, unfortunately, which need not be same as the national minimum wage, or it need not be what is the minimum wage in that particular state. No, India is a very large country, as you know, sort of 29 full states and 5 union territories, which have which is a kind of an arrangement between the union government and the state government, and there is a administrative responsibility shared by them. Yeah. So basically, we are talking of a large number of states here, large number of administrative units. Okay. So each state has a minimum wage, right? So Kerala has, one of the southern states, has the best minimum wages, right? Bihar would have one of the worst minimum wages. So within the country itself, we have different kinds of minimum wages. Minimum wages also vary across sectors, across activities. So it's a complete maze. Just to keep track of it may take you almost into an asylum. Yeah, mentally it can be a huge burden, right? So nonetheless, the point to note is that this particular program offered a minimum wage for the program in question, okay? And on that, 100 days of employment for the household was guaranteed, right? Now, this clearly was a kind of life and death question for the bottom, let's say 15-20% of the population, right? So in that sense, it was a very, very significant program. Yeah, those on the margins of survival, for them, as I said, it made the difference between life and death. I had done some field visits, surveys, etc., and I saw it firsthand. The kind of change, very much on the margin, nothing grand, but in terms of ensuring that at least they do not go hungry and so on. So very poor people certainly did benefit. And in particular, see, India's social geography is very complex. Castes and tribes and all kinds of things. So that social geography is indeed very complex in terms of different social groups. Right? And of course, the gender question, right? So women belonging to relatively vulnerable sections, yeah, have it extremely difficult. Okay, so you might recall a very interesting statement by Susan George in a book, How the Other Half Dies. She asks a rhetorical question: is there a poorer person than the poorest man? And then rhetorical answer to that rhetorical question is, yes, indeed, his wife. Right? So we know that this gender dimension is something which is indeed an extremely important issue. So, those who were in extreme need of support, right, certainly benefited from it. And as I said, it has a long history of dabbling with different kinds of programs and so on. What made it possible, of course, was a massive political mobilization by broadly those on the left political parties, lots of civil society organizations, right? And a government, a political party which came to power, which was willing to listen to, this very diverse coalition. Yeah. As it happens, all through there has been attempt to try and basically not allow it to function as well and as efficiently by different governments in the last 17 years. Right? In particular, during the last 7-8 years, yeah, there has been serious neglect of it. So, 100 days are guaranteed, but if you look at all India average, it basically comes to about 40 odd days, sometimes 43 days, sometimes 42 days. People want to get work as per the guarantee. If they do not get employment, then they are they can claim allowance for the lack of work or the work not being given to them. Yeah, so that is very much part of the act, right? But through various ways and means, there is a way to uh, delay their demand for work and etc. So it leads to what, generally speaking, is known as discouraged worker effect. So if you keep applying for work and you don't get it for the first week, the second week, the third week, then you don't go there for the fourth week. It's a waste of time. Yeah, the payments get more and more delayed, right? So, the entire mechanism of payments have been changed, where this um, technology and the mediation by technology, yeah, and half the time you find that it simply doesn't work. Either you do not have electricity in the local rural office where this person has gone and is claiming her wage, or the thumb impression, yeah, does not match what is there in the record. Some of you will probably know that even in advanced capitalist countries where this ID, which is a technological ID, is used for various services, 10 to 15% mismatch is there. So imagine people who use their hands for manual labor, right? Now, clearly the thumb impression, goes for a toss. Then it does not match. What do? Right? Wages get deferred, they get not paid, denied, and so on, right? So there are lots of these challenges which have happened. So the potential of it is not fully realized, but in principle, it is a program which is, I would say, an extremely interesting program. The roots of it actually go back to many centuries. In fact, during the Mughal period, in India, when there were serious difficulties because of monsoon failure or something, these programs for short durations were launched, right? So there is a historical kind of record which actually takes us back, takes us into the early 80 years, right? So in that sense, we have a long history of it, yeah, of course, on a very limited scale. But what happened in 2005 is indeed historic. Is as I said right at the outset, the only India is the only country where you actually have a right to employment as a guarantee. Of course, it's for very limited kind of work and for rural areas. Okay, so let me stop here at this point, and then if you have any further clarifications, I would be very happy to come back to this conversation. I can see that Edlira has raised her hand.
Yes. So now, thanks very much, Professor. That's really great. You gave the both sides to open this discussion more profound. So now we open the questions for the floor. Please, if you have questions, you could just raise your hands up. Yes, Indira, please.
My question is on something else, actually. It's a bit related to one point that you are making in the video lecture, where you actually are saying that the strategies for the autonomous capitalist development that were pursued by many developing countries after independence from colonialism were deeply flawed. And that's one of the contributing factors to this reserve army in so many of the countries in the South. So, but you haven't developed more on these flawed policies. So I wonder whether you could actually elaborate a bit further on that.
Yes, sure. If we look across the world, right? Let's say broadly, if you divide middle of the 20th century or so, if you are looking at the economic geography of the world, right? You had socialist bloc countries, you take those out. Yeah? Basically, USSR and China, if you keep these out, and if you're looking at the capitalist bloc and total number of countries and so on, roughly, sort of 4/5 of these countries are so-called developing countries at that point in time. And one-fifth is what we would describe as advanced countries, developed countries, etc. Right? Now, if you are looking at all these countries which are part of the four-fifths or so, one kind of connecting thread is that almost all of them were colonies or semi-colonies, right? If you look at history of the world, 1750, look at what today we call developed countries and third world or developing, yeah? Look at 1750. In fact, it is the mirror opposite in terms of per capita income, in terms of index of industrialization and so on. Let me just give you one number. You know, India and China in 1750 accounted for, just these two countries, accounted for 52 to 59%, as per different estimates, of the total non-agricultural production of the world. Of the total non-agricultural production of the world, only these two countries accounted for, let's say, almost 55%. You add a Turkey, you add Egypt, you add a few other countries, we are talking of, you know, sort of contemporary third world, it would be almost 90%. Where was the West? Where was the North? Right? In agriculture, in any case, Africa, Asia, and Latin America were way ahead, precisely because of gifts of nature. The geography was such, yeah, that it endowed them to take 2 crops, 3 crops, and so on. Look at Northwestern Europe. What is the agricultural cycle? Even today, you know, with all technological advancements and so on, you're basically talking of 1 crop cycle, yeah, 1 main crop, yeah, in the winter and spring and so on and so forth, right? So agriculture, in any case, this part of the world was much better, and non-agriculture, this was the story around the middle of the 18th century or so, 1750, 1950, middle of the 20th century. China and India, their combined share is barely 2 to 3%. How did that happen? So you have a very profound story there, colonialism, semi-colonialism, etc., and how that messes up, you know, the global South, what later, you know, became global South, etc. Now, without getting into all that, yeah, the point which is very important from your intervention is, what is it that they did? Yeah, these countries. Now, you have a handful of countries, you know, in these 130, 40 countries that we are talking about, developing countries and third world and so on, a handful of them certainly managed to make a reasonable structural transformation. Right? One of the key things there was adequate attention to the land question, in particular land reforms. Right? So if you look at South Korea and compare that with India, early 1950s, yeah, if you look at their plan documents, remove the first page, right, which gives you the name of the country, the documents looked identical. Right? They were talking exactly about the same things, you know, how to take care of agriculture, planned industrialization, and so on. South Korea managed to do it. India was a relatively pale shadow of South Korea, right? In South Korea, you know, within 3 years of the total cultivable land, almost 35 to 45%, again, different estimates, etc., or let's say close to 40%, was redistributed, yeah, of the total cultivable land within 3 years. Right? Of course, it was done by the occupation army, right? As it was done in the case of Japan. Yeah, General MacArthur was leading the charge. Just imagine, you know, US, which is completely opposed to, you know, messing up with private property rights, is changing private property rights in a faraway country on a massive scale. Why? You know, because these countries were being propped as anti-communist regimes, and they realized that it would be very good for these regimes to have, a kind of economic growth which is broadly shared, equitable, and so on. And land reforms is a key to that, right? Okay. And there were many other factors there. Let me not get into too many details. So when I talk of limitations and problems of structural transformation, this is one of the key things. Right? In India, over a 50-year period, you barely see 2 to 3% of total cultivable land getting redistributed. So imagine 30 to the 35, 40% in 3 years and 2 to 3% over a period of 50 years. Right? So this huge problem that you have in India's countryside is connected with the massive land inequities. Right? In large parts of the global south, you have similar issues, similar problems in Africa, in Latin America, and so on. Right? Brazil, I mean, where Cheng is sitting right now. Yes. So it's a major question. MST, it's a movement, very powerful movement, and its demand on the land question and so on. All of us know about these things. So that's one aspect of it. Joe Studwell has an excellent book which talks about what can we learn about a massive structural transformation, which is absolutely dramatic, positive, which takes care of poverty in one generation. And he gives you the example of East Asia, this book by Joe Studwell. It's a very well-known book, 2013 book. Right? And incidentally, I became aware of this book on a flight reading Bill Gates's, Bill Gates had written a review of this book. And he said that basically, this will sum it up, your question. There are 3 steps. Focus on the land question, agrarian reforms, that is what we learned. Second, focus on small businesses. Include them, give them support, right? And then you see how that takes care of the problem. Okay. And then finally, you can have your world champions. But before you start focusing on your world champions, you have to take care of your small guys and those in agriculture. If you do that, that is a recipe for success. That takes care of the labor question in a much more significant fashion. Includes them into relatively virtuous cycle of economic transformation. Of course, we can say that South Korea, now politically, it had a huge problem. It was an authoritarian regime, and etc. Right? So, likewise, if you look at Taiwan's experience, pretty similar. Building very massively on labor-intensive industrialization, which is at the center of economic transformation of Taiwan. So these are the issues pertaining to the overall strategy of structural transformation. This is where roughly you will find of the 130, 140 countries, about 15 of them, 20 of them max, have done somewhat better, reasonably well, very well, gradation. About 120 odd, have actually messed up some very basic messages there of structural transformation, which creates the problem of labor reserves more and more serious. So large number of countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, So barring a handful of these 15 to 20 countries, we can talk about, any of these. I hope that answers your question, Adlira.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. That's really profound and also very good review from the historic point of view. Let me also contribute one point. Like we often thought like the land in the situation of like United States would be private, but actually by what we know in the 19th century, it was through the state, through a semi-socialization of the land with almost $1 to distribute to all the people who are freed or who are migrant to the continent of North America, was all got distributed of land. So let's not really ignore this point, right? Because we often take for granted land in the United States, always private, always through this kind of capitalistic way, but it was not. And that was really profound. One question of line referring to this reserve army of labor, as you also mentioned in the video lectures, many conditions we could not do, because in the period of time of industrialization in Europe, they have so many people went to the rest of the world, and which today we are not able to do that. So now allow me to touch on another important element is about technology, which is our second question. And please allow me to elaborate here.
Yes.
So as you highlighted in the video lecture, that technological changes become essential to the functioning of the capitalist system that produces and depends on the surplus labor. Yeah. So the dilemma now lies for many developing countries. On the one hand, if they're catching up these technological adoptions, especially these labor-saving ones, may result in the reproduction of surplus labor and high employment, therefore low wages. On the other hand, resisting these technologies might make the countries lag behind by other countries, meanwhile to create high underemployment. Although this tool said was not that much relevant in a way, but given this, what kind of the development trajectory should be considered for the developing countries? Yeah, Professor, it's your floor.
Yes. Very, very important question, and an extremely difficult question in terms of any easy answers, policy answers, etc. But before I come to that, since you mentioned North America, we should also remember that North America and this whole mobility of people to begin with Great Britain and then rest of the European continent, continental Europe, ideally it should not be called migration. Yeah, I think that's a very kind of politically speaking an incorrect expression. It was capturing these territories, right, via force, okay, largely using genocide as the tool. So the North American population, the native population, the indigenous population, as you know, was almost entirely wiped out, right? And this is something, yeah, which needs to be sort of recognized for its horror, for its scale, for what it did to that continent and so on. And in the inverse, the implication of it for Europe. Let me actually give you a statement from, again, going back to history, 1895, by a gentleman called, and I'm sure all of you have heard of him, Cecil Rhodes, right? Infamous imperialist Rhodes, who basically set his sight on African continent, right? Southern cone of Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Okay, so the statement is that I was in the east end of London, a working class quarter yesterday, and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread, and on my way home, I pondered over the scene, and I became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is a solution for the social problem. That is, in order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid a civil war, you must become imperialists, right? Straight from the mouth of the horse, right? Okay. Now, what was happening in continental Europe or Great Britain at that point in time? You had a massive scale of population being made superfluous, surplus, right? They had nowhere to go. 17th century Netherlands, there were official expeditions of hunting those who had left rural areas and were viewed as dangerous elements for the urban pockets and so on. Officially sanctioned expeditions to decimate them, right? So you have all this as part of the history of that particular continent, okay, European continent, I'm saying, yeah, and it was dealing with exactly this kind of problem, a problem which in many ways was possibly much worse, right? The first poverty law, the poor laws, came in existence in 1602, and why? Precisely to take care of these kind of what they viewed as the kind of marauding masses, yeah, who have been expelled from agriculture, from rural areas, and could become a huge danger to the sort of peace and so on and so forth, right? The solution, as Mr. Rhodes tells us, go grab, yeah, North America, parts of Latin America, other places, put them in employment in other places. So you basically had on the two extremes, one was colonies of settlement, the other was colonies of conquest, right? So many of them came to India, which was a classic colony of conquest. They did not settle down, but then they found employment here, right? In the military, in many other ways, and so on and so forth. So all that played a major role in their surplus kind of addressing the surplus labor question, right? Those days, of course, the technology was not as labor displacing as today. But nonetheless, I mean, just to give you, from the very early days of, let's say, industrialization, 1770s, okay, in England, which is very early days of the factory system, yeah. According to Montu, this very well-known study, the early machines in the leading industry of the day, the cotton textiles in Britain, were simple, but they displaced labor on a massive scale. One of the earliest technological innovation, spinning jenny. A single spinning jenny had up to 80 spindles, and it displaced 78 traditional spinners. One machine, one of the earliest technological innovation, right? While by the end of the 18th century, automatic mule spindles with up to 500 spindles that came into use, rendering almost 500 and more people, yeah, because it was technologically more advanced, okay? Traditional weavers and spinners and so on, yeah. So you can imagine technological progress, which is indeed part of the material progress and is important, and we must welcome it, right? But at that point in time, European continent could send them to wherever they wanted to send them, precisely because of the colonial order and so on. Where does Global South send its surplus labor? To the Atlantic, to the Indian Ocean, to the Pacific Ocean, to drown them? What do you do with them, right? That is where it's an exceedingly important, although a very difficult question. How do you find a balance between different sectors and needs of population located in different economic activities, etc., which is impossible to address in a context of neoliberal globalization? You just can't address it. There's just no way. Because then you have no autonomous policy space to control any of this, right? What was happening under regulated capitalism was that you could control it, yeah, not fully, not completely, but in a manner where you could say, all right, we will have some employment policy. We will ensure that, this thing happens, that thing happens. We can reserve a few activities for the small players, right? We subsidize them. We try and take care of them in very many ways and so on and so forth. So it is a set of policies which we need to think about, right? But that can happen only if you're talking of a capitalist system. It can happen only in a context of regulated capitalism, right? What has happened in the last 50 years is that we have transited to a system which, by and large, is uncontrollable, right? We have, uh, we are confronting a situation where finance capital is the single biggest economic actor in the world. Every government shakes in front of it, right? It submits to it, it bows to it, right? Even the most powerful country in the world, United States of America, both economically and militarily, at least thus far, right? There is a revolving door between the Wall Street and the White House. Okay, so the power of the finance capital, and this is a major problem because finance does not make profits fundamentally through production. It makes profit through speculation. Then what happens? You simply don't employ anyone, right? So it is these things, which we have to analyze very carefully to understand why is it that we have such a huge challenge of labor surplus, not only in the global south, but in the global north as well, right? Increasingly, if you look at document after document by 1980s, whether it is coming from World Bank, whether it is coming from UN system, various UN organizations and so on, ILO, UNCTAD, UNDP, etc. Each document uses a phrase, jobless growth. So you have growth, but there are no jobs, right? Why has such a situation come about? There are a number of factors there. I gave you only one factor. So the real challenge is twofold. One, how do you reclaim at least some relatively autonomous policy space? That's the question for each country. Large countries can do it relatively more easily. China and India, Brazil, and so on and so forth. Small countries find that almost impossible. They get completely swamped, right? Let me give you just one stat here in terms of understanding the economic power in the contemporary world. If you look at the 100 top entities in the world in terms of revenues, annual revenues, 100 top economic entities, 71 of these are multinational corporations, only 29 are countries. Of the top 100 economic entities in terms of annual revenue. Now imagine a Walmart, Amazon, or whoever else, getting into a negotiation with a Cambodia. You have a company 500 billion, 600 billion, 700 billion, and so on. The size of, and here you have the GDP of the country, which is 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion, right? Now, if you look at some 40 odd least developed countries, they would barely add up to one of these behemoths, one of these giants, right? In terms of the total, actually, I'm going now beyond revenue. I'm saying in terms of their total income, their GDP, right? Now, it's massively unequal terrain in which they have to bargain if you expose them to each other, right? So at the end of the day, this is, as I said, one of the most difficult questions and something which is impossible to address in a context of neoliberal globalization. Globalization has its advantages. We could discuss some of those, right? But the point is, can we think of a situation which is relatively level playing field or not? The policy choices can be indeed opted for by the countries in question, and even the smallest countries, even the tiny countries. Will that be feasible? Yeah. Should that happen, then indeed we can think of balancing between technological progress versus people's needs. And what is the point of having a 10% growth rate if nobody is getting employed? And after all, the purpose of growth is, a widely shared kind of uh, sort of, benefits, whatever is coming out of that growth process for the population at large. Now, if you don't get included at all, yeah, so that is the challenge, right? Otherwise, what will happen? And this is my last point on this question. Basically, then we start relying on what can be called giving them doles, right? All these people who are part of this huge indigent, surplus, superfluous population, you just give them some handouts, some doles, which is obviously not the, not the way to kind of address the, whole issue. There is a question of, livelihood with dignity, right? Or getting something from the system in a dignified manner, right? Dole is a very temporary and a crisis kind of context solution, yeah? But taking that beyond that, but this is exactly what is being planned in the global economic system currently. Yeah, whether it is ILO, whether it is all these other organizations. See, sort of unfortunately, even though I have a lot of empathy with ILO, I also was a short-term employee of the ILO for, in case, so I, a kind of a insider, at least for a while. But unfortunately, ILO is not quite pushing for what I would consider a kind of policy terrain, framework, etc., which can address these issues in a more substantive manner. It's possibly playing on the margin, yeah, and possibly because nobody listens to it. Who knows? Let me stop there and let me take another question if you have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor, for this very, very profound reviews. Yes, now we're open for questions. So since now we have 50 minutes, so maybe we could collect a few questions and for the final remarks from the professor. Yeah, if so far people was thinking, yeah, okay, Benji, please.
Thank you, Cheng. Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks. Just a short question. So I understand it in the global south, these are countries with high labor surplus. So does this mean that these countries will also have generally low wages because of the competition between among workers? So is this always the case, or has there been countries where like this has been contradicted in practice? Like has there been countries with high labor surplus but they have had the chance to have some kind of higher wages, and if so, were there any extraordinary reasons for that? Thank you.
By and large, wages are connected with two things. One indeed is the overall level of economic well-being and levels of productivity, etc. So historically speaking, that is one important component of it, right? Labor is a major contributor to the economic well-being, and under certain conditions, yeah, it manages to get at least part of what it contributes, right? Now, if the productivity is very high, then, and if you get, let's say, 50% of that, 60% of that or so, you get a decent wage, right? So, partly it is linked to Yeah. In a long run historical sense, the overall economic progress, productivity increases, etc. Labor nowhere gets what it contributes. It always gets less than what it contributes. But at least, if the productivity levels are rising, very significantly, then your wage also is in some proportion to that. So that's one. So if you take that into account, clearly you can see why the wages in the countries which are relatively much more advanced economically would be higher compared to those which remain economically at disadvantage, right? So low wage countries are also countries which are, in terms of per capita income, etc., whether you look at it in terms of exchange rate or purchasing power or many other ways, this would be a kind of a consensus point of view that yes, indeed, there is this difference, which has to do partly with, and in a significant manner, with levels of overall economic progress and productivity, right? However, through public interventions, state, for instance, can decide, let's say, two countries which are roughly at par in terms of indicators of economic well-being, economic progress, per capita income, etc. But in one country, you may find that they are left to the mercy of the market, nothing is being done. Whereas in the second country, you have the state, again, through a process of political mobilization, which says that you have to give slightly higher wages. That would be the minimum wage, right? So you will certainly find such examples. Look at any continent, And when I'm talking of wage, I'm not talking of wage in a very narrow sense. What is being made available, let's say, from the point, from the factory, from the economic enterprise and so on. Let's think in terms of the social security, which is part of the wage, certain kinds of protective measures, which are part of the wage. So what is known as the social wage, right? So if you look at, for instance, social security provisions in Nepal, right? Compare that with India, right? India is supposed to be, sort of in the developing world, a major country. And, when President Barack Obama had come to India in 2008, he had said India is not an emerging country, India has emerged, right? So I am still searching for the India which has emerged. I don't even know if there is an emerging India, but let me not get into that conversation right now. But Nepal does better on social security than India. It's a very significant issue that you need to take note of, right? Yeah, because you have a government which is much more inclined to the basic needs of workers, etc. It pushes for that. Yeah, it takes some significant steps for that. Yeah. So in terms of old age pension and many other dimensions of social security and so on, you do find such differences, right? But in general, it is indeed the case that if you're talking about market-driven economies where the entire wage process is determined via the logic of the market, then in fact, wages would actually get pushed to the subsistence level in all such economies where you have large surplus labor, right? Unless there's a political intervention, unless there's an intervention by the state which is driven by political mobilization, you will see that kind of situation. So, let me give you the example of India. For instance, there is a minimum wage, but that gets flouted so frequently. And if you look at the most vulnerable workers for which we are talking about the minimum wage, 70–80% of them don't get any minimum wage. Right? It's again astounding number. Yeah, I mean, gross and mass scale violation of something which we would take as a major guarantee. Right? So there are these issues which we need to keep in mind. And of course, differences between the North and South, the wage levels, early 2000s, for instance. Yeah, the average manufacturing wages, if you compared between, let's say, China and the US, yeah, average manufacturing wages. Okay, just that. Okay, it was sort of a ratio which was truly astounding. You're talking of some 64 cents for China and about 20 US dollars for US, right? For doing exactly the same job. Okay. One of the big push, yeah, that we saw in the global economy in the last 40, 50 years or so is basically shift of production from the north to the south. Select destinations, not everywhere, right? East Asia became a major beneficiary of it, right? Now, it is not only because of wage, but other factors as well. But wage, plays an important role there. In economics, political economy discussions, this is known as international labor arbitrage, right? Now, wages in China are roughly 2 to 3 times that of India. But you have more of capital from north, more of FDI from north going to China and other East Asian countries than to India. So clearly there are other factors which play an important role. It's not only the wage difference. It is the quality of infrastructure, the quality of skilled workforce, yeah, for lots of activities that we are talking about. All these factors will have to be taken into account, right? But in general, some of these developments which we see, especially in the last 50 odd years or so, has a lot to do with the wage differences, yeah, in a globalized economy and how that determines certain kinds of economic behavior, right? Which also means that in many of these countries, there is an attempt to push the wages to the rock bottom because you want to attract, yeah, investments from outside. But then it has its costs. Okay. So I hope your question has been answered, Benjamin.
Yes,
if you have a supplementary question, feel free. Yes.
Yes, Benji, if you have the following up question, please feel free as well. Yeah, so now, thanks very much. And maybe just 5 minutes, like a very short, but always big questions. Just, as a very practical, we're talking about at the beginning, you give us a brief review of the Rural Guarantee Act. I think it's very impressive, as also you mentioned. Every country have a constitution, give the right to work, but none of them actually realize that. But one question is that we know many jobs in this Rural Guarantee Act are more on the infrastructure projects. So my question is, looking at the sustainability perspective of this act, what do you think on this? If all long run, please.
Yeah, at least in the short run, yeah, short to medium term, given the deficits in infrastructure, and when we say infrastructure, right now the focus is on building, let's say, village roads and connectivities between rural and urban areas and those kinds of roads, etc. So physical infrastructure of certain kinds, yeah, irrigation infrastructure, village ponds, irrigation facilities, and so on. So there's quite a lot of deficit, yeah, in this area itself, which can absorb, the demand for work in these areas for a foreseeable future, by which I mean at least a few decades, yeah, 2, 3, 4 decades, right? And there is nothing to stop us then to move, once that is saturated, to move to social infrastructure. The gaps there are huge, right? With respect to support to education, support to healthcare, support to, in general, let's say, care economy. Care economy is going to be a big thing everywhere in the world, right? Now, why can't we explore all these options and possibilities, right? So, and all these can be in the public domain, right? Without leaving these to the private parties and who basically are driven by the quest for accumulation and private profits and so on, right? I mean, private profit is okay, but if it becomes unshackled Shylock, then we don't certainly want, that kind of private profiteers, right? In any decent society, we have to think of, how do we balance the social needs and the needs of capital, etc. Right? So there is a lot of space. Chang, I'm completely convinced, in much of the global south, we can, my assessment would be we have to do some hard exercises, etc. But at least for the next 50 odd years, you can think of creative policies which serve the needs of physical and social infrastructure. And then we move on to other things. There would always be activities and areas, which can be created, which can be found. I mean, there is no sort of end to it. Human ingenuity and creativity never dries up and dies. So we can always rely on that and hope to certainly find ways and means. But this is something which is a very good option. This employment guarantee kind of activities. And in India, for the last few years, many of us have been talking about, and there is a lot of political mobilization also, for Urban Employment Guarantee Act. So not only rural, but then make it pan-Indian, make it for the country as a whole. So include the urban also. Why is it that the urban areas should be excluded from this, right? So there is no economic logic, right? So number one, in terms of its potential, to include people in some kind of decent work and decent remuneration, this is very significant, provided you implement it properly. As I told you, the implementation has been a huge problem. There is no problem of design, but the way it's being messed up. In fact, what was conceived in 2005 and the way it has moved, a lot of new things have been added. Many new activities have been added to Employment Guarantee Act in rural areas, right? So certainly, we have to keep exploring, etc. So if one is committed to it, then there are very significant potentials which can certainly be explored and reaped. So that would be my suggestion as a policy response which is potentially very robust.
Yes, thank you so much. That's exactly, and we should definitely give applause to this left mobilization in India, which have make it true. And this could be also taken reference for us in the developing countries. One of the direction thinking, how can we mobilize these ideas to realize such an act in our countries as well? Thank you so much, Professor Jha. It's always enjoyable in your class, your lectures. It looks like listening to stories are very interesting with the perceptual understandings. Thank you so much. It's very privileged for us to have you today in this workshop. Also, thank you.
It was indeed a pleasure. And in any case, all of you are very kind to me. So, you are being more generous than, what I deserve. So thank you for your generosity.